In the humid summer of 1958, during the careful deconstruction of the old rectory beside St. Louis Cathedral, workers broke through a false wall in the basement, revealing a small, dry cavity. Inside lay a single object, a leather-bound journal, its pages filled with the elegant, frantic script of a priest who had vanished from all records a century earlier. This document, now held in the Louisiana State Archives, details what may be the most terrifying slave market in the history of New Orleans, a place so profane it was systematically erased from the city's memory. The journal asks a question that history has refused to answer. How did an entire cabal of the city's most powerful men disappear after purchasing one woman? And what dark secret did the church bury to ensure this story was never told? The case of the Marché des Perdus is not merely a forgotten crime, it is the story of a hidden spiritual war fought in the shadows of antebellum America, a massacre of souls that began in a desecrated theater. It chronicles the complete disappearance of buyers and sellers alike, culminating in a mysterious fire that authorities ruled an accident, despite evidence of something far more sinister. The priest's journal suggests the fire was not an end, but a seal, locking away a horror that science still refuses to study, a power that was unleashed within those walls and may still linger beneath the streets of the city today, a dark secret waiting to be rediscovered. These are the stories that exist in the margins of history, hidden in sealed documents and forgotten archives. If you believe that the most important truths are the ones that were meant to be buried, then subscribe to Before the Story and be sure to enable notifications so you never miss an investigation. We value the depth and rigor of our research, so if you appreciate this approach, please take a moment to like this video. It tells us we are on the right path. Let us know in the comments from what part of the world you are joining us to uncover this story tonight. The journal, discovered in 1958, was identified by archivists as belonging to Father Antoine Dubois, a French Creole priest who served at the St. Louis Cathedral until his unexplained disappearance in late 1852. Its first entry, dated October of that year, does not begin with prayer, but with a confession of profound spiritual dread. Dubois writes of a place known only to the city's elite, a clandestine market operating outside of law, and he feared outside of God's grace. He names it Le Marché des Perdus, the Market of the Lost, a title born of his own tormented conscience. For he admits to having known of its existence for months, his silence a sin he felt compelled to expiate through this secret record. This document is the only known primary source that acknowledges the market, a testament to its successful concealment. Dubois describes it as the final destination for the untouchables of the slave trade, those individuals deemed too broken, too sick, or too spiritually defiant for the public auctions in the St. Louis Hotel. These were human beings whose suffering was considered a commodity, their despair repackaged for a clientele with specific dark appetites. The market was a wound on the city's soul, festering in the shadows cast by the grand facades of New Orleans' booming economy, a place where the logic of commerce devolved into something far more primitive and horrifying. The journal establishes Father Dubois not as a detached observer, but as a man implicated by his own knowledge. He was the confessor to several of the wealthy planters and merchants who, he suspected, frequented this unholy exchange. Their veiled confessions of moral decay and spiritual emptiness now took on a terrifying new context. He writes of their anxieties not as simple matters of sin, but as symptoms of a deeper corruption, a sickness of the soul that was being nurtured in a specific physical place. His decision to document the events was therefore an act of penance, an attempt to map the geography of a hell he had allowed to flourish in his own parish. The historical setting provided by Dubois is precise. New Orleans, in 1852, a city at the apex of its wealth and decadence, its port teeming with cotton and sugar, its culture a vibrant mix of French, Spanish, and American influences. Yet beneath this veneer of prosperity lay a brutal foundation. The slave trade was the engine of its economy, a fact of life so deeply integrated into the social fabric that its horrors were rendered invisible through daily routine. The market of the lost, as Dubois presents it, was the logical if monstrous extension of this system, a place where the system's most inconvenient and disturbing products could be disposed of quietly. His writing paints a world of sharp contrasts. The solemnity of the cathedral and the profane whispers in the drawing rooms of the garden district, the public performance of piety and the private pursuit of degradation. The market thrived in this hypocrisy, protected by a conspiracy of silence among the city's most powerful men. They were bound not by formal oaths, but by a shared, unspoken understanding that what happened in the shadows of the riverfront was essential to maintaining the bright, orderly world they controlled. This collective guilt, Dubois theorized, was a force as strong as any law. The initial pages of the journal serve as a promise, a framing device for the horror to come. Dubois vows to record not just the facts of the market, but the terrible justice he senses is beginning to unfold. He speaks of a reckoning, a spiritual balancing of accounts that he can feel gathering like a storm over the city. This premonition transforms his journal from a simple historical record into a prophetic text. He's no longer just a priest documenting a crime. He is a witness preparing to testify to a divine or demonic intervention in the affairs of men, a mystery he felt compelled to solve. The opening entries build a world saturated with a sense of impending doom. The very air of New Orleans, as Dubois describes it, feels heavy with unspoken sins. The humidity, the scent of decay from the swamps, the constant tolling of the cathedral bells, all are imbued with a symbolic weight. He is documenting a city that is physically and spiritually ill, and the market is the primary vector of this disease. The stage is set not just for a human drama of crime and punishment, but for a profound moral and supernatural conflict that threatens to consume everyone involved. The weight of this responsibility is palpable in Dubois' script. The lines are precise, but carry the tremor of a man writing against time, as if he fears he will not be able to finish before the events he is describing consume him as well. He is creating an archive of a ghost story before the ghosts have even been made, chronicling a disappearance before the people have yet vanished. This sense of inevitability, of a tragedy already written and now simply playing out, gives the exposition a powerful, haunting quality that hooks the reader into the unfolding mystery. The final element established in this section is the central artifact itself, the journal. It is presented as a survivor, a lone voice speaking from a past that has been deliberately silenced. Its existence is a small miracle, a defiance of the historical erasure that followed. The narrative voice of the documentary relies on this artifact entirely, using it as the lens through which the entire story will be viewed. The journey the audience is about to take is not just into a historical mystery, but into the tormented mind of the only man who dared to write it all down. A week after his initial confession, Father Dubois' journal provides the first detailed account of the market itself. He describes following a parishioner, a man whose soul he knew to be troubled, down the muddy, gaslit streets toward the riverfront. They arrived at a place that had once been a vaudeville theatre, a grand building now fallen into disrepair, its marquee dark and its doors guarded by men who did not ask for names. Inside, the city's elite, Planters, merchants, judges sat in decaying velvet chairs, their faces obscured by the deep shadows of the auditorium, a silent congregation awaiting a profane sermon. On the stage, illuminated by the unsteady hiss of a few gas lamps, stood a figure who represented the market's ultimate blasphemy, a disgraced priest named Father Jean-Pierre Moreau. Dubois describes him as a man excommunicated for heresy years prior, now repurposed as a master of ceremonies for this grotesque theatre. Moreau would perform a twisted parody of a blessing over each transaction, anointing the exchange of money for human life with holy water and Latin phrases. This ritual, Dubois writes, was not for God, but was a performance for the buyers, a way to launder their sins and grant their cruelty a veneer of divine sanction. The central anomaly of that night, the event that shifted the course of Dubois' investigation, was the auction of a young woman named Amara. The ledger, which Dubois would later discover, listed her as having been brought from the Ashanti region of West Africa and branded as insane by her previous owners. When she was brought onto the stage, however, Dubois saw something else. He describes her not as mad, but as possessing an unnerving stillness, a profound and heavy silence that seemed to absorb the light and sound around her. Her eyes, he notes, were not vacant, but watchful, as if she were the one assessing the men in the audience. The bidding for Amara was unusually tense. She was considered damaged goods, a risk, yet the men in the front rows competed for her with a strange fervor. Dubois recognized several of them: a wealthy sugarcane planter named Etienne Devereux, a notoriously cruel cotton merchant, and others whose public reputations were impeccable. He describes the air growing cold as they approached the stage to inspect her, their hands touching her arms and face. In that moment, Dubois writes of a palpable shift in the atmosphere, a deep, resonant silence that fell over the theatre, a quiet so profound it felt like the building itself was holding its breath. Etienne Devereux won the bid. As he led Amara from the stage, Dubois recounts feeling a chill so intense it felt like a premonition of death. He tried to rationalize it, to attribute the feeling to the profane rituals, the flickering lights, the general depravity of the environment. He told himself he was merely a man of God reacting to a scene of profound sinfulness. Yet he could not shake the image of Amara's eyes as she was led away. He was certain that he had witnessed not a sale, but a form of spiritual contract being signed, with terms that none of the buyers understood. This event is documented as the turning point in Dubois' journal. Before this night, he was investigating a human crime, a secret society built on exploitation. After this night, he began to suspect he was dealing with something else entirely. The stillness of the woman, the unnatural cold, the sudden oppressive silence in the theatre, these were not elements of a simple slave auction. They were, in his increasingly fearful mind, the hallmarks of a supernatural presence, a power that had been dormant and was now, for some reason, awakened by the profane proceedings on the stage. The anomaly was not just Amara herself, but the reaction she induced. The buyers, men accustomed to absolute power and control, seemed unnerved by her, yet also drawn to her. It was as if her perceived madness was a mirror, reflecting their own moral corruption back at them in a way that was both terrifying and alluring. Dubois notes that their desire to possess her seemed driven by a need to conquer the inexplicable, to own the very thing that unsettled them. This psychological dynamic added another layer of complexity and dread to the scene he witnessed. The entry for that night concludes with a sentence that serves as a hook for the entire tragedy to follow. After describing Devereux leaving the theatre with Amara, Dubois writes a short, desperate prayer for the planter's soul. He then adds a final chilling observation that transforms his record from a chronicle into a prophecy. He writes, "I pray for Monsieur Devereux, for in her eyes I saw not madness. I saw a judgment that had already been passed and a sentence that was about to be carried out. The weight of this final sentence hangs over the narrative. The first anomaly has been documented, and with it, the central mystery has been given a face and a name. Amara is no longer just another victim of a cruel system. She has been positioned as a catalyst, an agent of a power that the market and its patrons have unwittingly unleashed. The question is no longer just about the existence of the market, but about the nature of the woman they just sold, and the fate of the man who bought her. In the weeks following the auction of Amara, Father Dubois' journal entries become a meticulous chronicle of accumulating dread. The first entry, dated 1 week after the sale, notes the quiet, unsettling rumor that Etienne Devereux has vanished. There was no sign of a struggle at his Garden District mansion, no note, no ransom demand. His servants, when questioned discreetly by Dubois, claimed their master had simply walked out into the evening mist one night and had not returned. The city police, influenced by the Devereux family's desire to avoid scandal, treated the matter as a private affair, a man who had perhaps fled his duties or his debtors. This official indifference did not soothe Dubois. He saw not a simple disappearance, but the fulfillment of the terrible premonition he had felt in the theatre. He began a quiet investigation of his own, speaking to dock workers, carriage drivers, and other priests, searching for any scrap of information that might explain Devereux's fate. He found nothing. It was as if a man of immense wealth and social standing had been erased from the city as cleanly as a line of chalk on a slate, leaving behind only a void and a growing sense of unease in the priest's mind. The second anomaly followed 2 weeks later. A cotton merchant named Jean-Luc Richard, a man whom Dubois had also seen bidding for Amara that night, disappeared in a nearly identical fashion. He left his office in the commercial district, telling his clerk he was heading home for dinner, and was never seen again. Once more, the official response was muted. Richard was known to have complicated business dealings, and it was assumed he had absconded to escape financial ruin. Dubois, however, saw a clear and terrifying pattern emerging. He began to cross-reference the names of the men he had seen at the market with newspaper reports and society gossip, searching for connections. He found that their only shared, undeniable link was their presence on the theatre stage that fateful night. They were all men who had approached Amara, who had participated in her inspection and bidding. He tried to rationalize the events, to formulate a theory that did not rely on the supernatural. Perhaps, he wrote, Amara had allies, other slaves or free people of color who were exacting a methodical revenge on her behalf. But this theory felt hollow. The disappearances were too clean, too silent. There were no bodies, no witnesses, no signs of violence. It was a form of removal, not murder. The men were not being killed, they were being unmade, their existence systematically deleted from the fabric of the city. This precision, this lack of any physical trace, began to erode Dubois' skepticism. He started to consider the possibility that the force at work was not human, that the justice being meted out was of a different, more ancient, and far more terrifying order. His journal entries from this period reflect a mind at war with itself. He fills pages with logical deductions and investigative notes, followed by long, desperate prayers and theological questions about the nature of evil. Could a human soul become a conduit for such a power? Could a place, like the theatre, become so saturated with sin that it developed its own malevolent consciousness? He was a man of reason and faith, and both were failing to provide him with a satisfactory explanation for the events unfolding around him. The accumulation of evidence was not just factual, it was atmospheric. Dubois describes a palpable change in the demeanor of the city's elite. The men he had once seen exuding confidence at society balls now seemed haunted, their eyes darting nervously, their conversations held in hushed, anxious tones. They did not speak of the disappearances openly, but a collective fear had taken root. They sensed, as he did, that something was hunting them, something that operated according to a logic they could not comprehend, and against which their money and power offered no protection. The third disappearance, that of a judge known for his brutal sentencing of runaway slaves, solidified Dubois' fears. The judge vanished from his own locked chambers, the windows still bolted from the inside. This final, impossible detail shattered Dubois' attempts at rationalization. No human agency could account for such an event. He was forced to confront the terrifying possibility that the force he was tracking was not of this world, and that its methods were not bound by the physical laws he understood. At the end of this section of his journal, Dubois concludes that he is not investigating a series of crimes, but a singular, ongoing, spiritual event. The disappearances were not separate incidents, but movements in a single dark symphony. The market had sold something far more dangerous than a human being. It had brokered a deal with a power it did not understand, and now that power was methodically collecting its debt. The evidence was no longer just anomalous. It was irrefutable proof of a supernatural reaping. With the disappearance of the judge, Father Dubois' investigation entered a new, more desperate phase. He abandoned the pretense of a rational explanation and began to operate on the terrifying assumption that he was tracking a supernatural entity. His first coherent hypothesis, formulated from the accumulated evidence, was that Amara herself was the agent of this retribution. He did not yet believe she was a demon or a spirit, but rather that years of suffering had hollowed her out, making her a perfect vessel for a vengeful power, perhaps an entity summoned by the profane rituals of the market itself. To test this theory, his journal details a plan to find her. He believed that if he could speak with her, if he could understand what had happened to her, he might be able to find a way to stop the disappearances. His investigation shifted from the drawing rooms of the elite to the hidden communities of the city's enslaved and free people of color. He used his position as a priest to move through these spaces, asking cautious questions, listening to rumors and stories that floated just beneath the surface of the official city life. This search brought him into contact with the rich, syncretic spiritual traditions of New Orleans, the blend of Catholicism and West African voodoo that the church officially condemned but which held immense power in the city. He learned of spirits of vengeance, of curses that could be laid upon tormentors, of rituals that could call down a justice that the laws of man denied. These stories, which he had once dismissed as mere superstition, now resonated with the terrible events he was witnessing. They provided a framework, a dark theology that could explain the impossible. His hypothesis solidified. Amara was not acting alone, but was the focal point of a collective ritual, a curse enacted by those who had suffered alongside her. This theory, while still terrifying, was at least comprehensible within a human, if spiritual, framework. It suggested a form of organized mystical resistance, a powerful and coordinated effort to punish the architects of their misery. This was a truth he could almost grasp, a form of justice he could on some level understand, even as it horrified him. However, this hypothesis was deeply complicated by his own sense of guilt. The narrative of the journal reveals that the second man to disappear, the merchant Jean-Luc Richard, had been one of Dubois' own parishioners. Weeks before his disappearance, Richard had come to confession, speaking in veiled terms of a grave sin of commerce, a transaction that had left him feeling spiritually tainted. Dubois, not understanding the context, had offered a standard penance for greed, absolving a sin whose true nature he had failed to comprehend. This memory haunted him. He believed that if he had pressed Richard, if he had understood the true meaning of his confession, he might have been able to intervene, to warn him, to save him. His failure to do so, he wrote, made him complicit in the man's fate. His investigation was therefore not just a quest for truth, but a desperate act of atonement. He was trying to save the next victim to make up for the one he had failed, a motivation that drove him deeper into the mystery, even as the personal risks grew. This personal connection gives his first hypothesis a powerful emotional weight. He was not just an objective investigator connecting dots. He was a priest wrestling with his own perceived failures, a man whose spiritual authority had been proven insufficient in the face of a true and profound evil. His quest to understand Amara's role was also a quest to understand the limits of his own faith and the consequences of his own blindness. He needed to believe in a human-driven plot because the alternative was too terrifying to contemplate. The formulation of this hypothesis represents a critical juncture in the narrative. It is the moment when the protagonist organizes the chaos of the preceding events into a coherent, if frightening, theory. This theory, though it would later prove to be incomplete, provided him with a clear course of action and a defined enemy. He was no longer just a passive observer of strange events. He was an active investigator with a specific target and a specific goal. The section ends with Dubois identifying his next target. He had learned through his inquiries that one of the guards from the theater lived in the swamps outside the city. He believed this man might know where Devereaux had taken Amara, or at least be able to provide more information about the market's inner workings. The journal entry concludes with his resolution to seek this man out, a decision that would lead him away from the relative safety of the city and deeper into the physical and spiritual wilderness that surrounded it. Armed with his hypothesis, Father Dubois attempted to bring his findings to the proper authorities, believing that even a hint of an organized slave rebellion would force them to act. His journal meticulously records the series of dismissals and threats that followed, documenting a social fracture not just between the powerful and the powerless, but within the ruling class itself, a division between those who wanted the truth exposed and the vast majority who demanded it remain buried. The city officials he approached, men who were themselves part of the elite social circles that patronized the market, dismissed the disappearances as unrelated incidents of runaway debtors or victims of common crime. His next attempt was to appeal to a higher moral authority, his own superior, the Bishop of New Orleans. Dubois presented his evidence, the pattern of disappearances, the existence of the profane market, and the complicity of the disgraced Father Moreau. The bishop's reaction, as recorded by Dubois, was not one of shock or moral outrage, but of cold, pragmatic fear. He was terrified not by the sin, but by the potential for scandal. A story involving a rogue priest, prominent citizens, and a secret slave market could bring ruin upon the church's reputation in the city. The bishop's response was swift and unequivocal. He ordered Dubois to cease his inquiries immediately, framing the command as a matter of spiritual obedience. He warned the younger priest that he was meddling with forces beyond his station, and that his obsession with this unfortunate matter bordered on fanaticism. The meeting, Dubois writes, was a devastating blow. It revealed that the wall of silence protecting the market extended into the very institution he had sworn to serve. The church, his ultimate refuge of moral certainty, had chosen institutional self-preservation over justice. This rejection marked the beginning of Dubois' profound isolation. His fellow priests, likely warned by the bishop, began to treat him with a cool distance. His friends among the city's gentry stopped inviting him to their homes. He was a man who knew a dangerous truth, and in a society built on comfortable fictions, this made him a pariah. His journal entries from this period are filled with a sense of betrayal and loneliness, the writings of a man who realizes he is utterly alone in his quest. He had become a ghost in his own city, haunting the edges of a society that wished he would simply disappear. The social fracture was now complete. On one side were the powerful institutions, the city government, the police, and the church, all engaged in a collective effort to suppress the truth. On the other side was Dubois, a solitary priest armed only with his journal and his terrible knowledge. This conflict underscores a central theme of the story, that the most horrifying conspiracies are not orchestrated by shadowy cabals, but are maintained by the silent, passive consent of ordinary people in positions of power who choose to look away. The pressure to conform, to forget what he had seen, was immense. Yet as another buyer vanished, this time a planter from a neighboring parish who disappeared from his hotel room, Dubois' resolve hardened. The institutional betrayal did not break him. It freed him. Released from his obligation to a corrupt hierarchy, he now saw his investigation as a purely spiritual mandate, a duty he owed not to the bishop, but to God and to the victims. His isolation became a form of purification, stripping away his institutional identity and leaving only the core of his moral conviction. He writes in his journal, "They have chosen a comfortable silence over a terrifying truth. They are all buyers at the market now, purchasing their peace with willful ignorance." This profound insight reframes the central conflict. The enemy was not just the market's operators, but the entire social structure that allowed it to exist. The evil was not just active cruelty, but the passive complicity that nurtured it. This understanding gave his quest a new, more revolutionary dimension. The record of this social fracture is essential to the story's moral weight. It demonstrates how institutions designed to uphold justice and morality can become the primary instruments of their suppression. It transforms Dubois' story from a simple mystery into a powerful indictment of a society that is willing to sacrifice its most vulnerable members and even its own soul to protect its secrets and its power. The section concludes with Dubois recommitting to his investigation, but with a new understanding of his place in the world. He was no longer trying to save the city from a hidden evil. He was simply trying to bear witness to it, to create a record that might one day, long after he was gone, speak the truth that no one else dared to utter. His journal was no longer just a collection of notes. It was an act of rebellion. Having been cast out by the formal structures of power, Father Dubois pursued the truth through more clandestine channels. His journal describes a meeting with a city coroner, an older man he knew to be both discreet and devout, who had been privately troubled by the official indifference to the disappearances. The coroner agreed to share his findings, providing Dubois with the first piece of tangible, irrefutable evidence that contradicted the narrative of men simply fleeing their lives. The evidence was connected to the first victim, Etienne Devereux. The coroner revealed that a fisherman had recently recovered Devereux's silver-tipped walking cane from the Mississippi River, snagged on a cypress root near the city's edge. While the cane itself proved little, It was what the coroner's men found on the riverbank nearby that was truly anomalous. In a small, secluded clearing, they discovered a patch of ground where the grass had turned a brittle, deathly white. The soil beneath was covered in a thin layer of a fine grey dust, a substance the coroner's primitive chemical tests could not identify. This detail, seemingly minor, had a profound impact on Dubois. The coroner added one more piece of sensory information that he had not included in his official and subsequently buried report. He told the priest that the dust had a faint, unmistakable smell of burnt sulfur, a scent that for a man of Dubois' learning and faith carried an immediate and terrifying connotation. It was, in the theological language of his world, the smell of demonic presence, the physical trace of hell's intrusion into the mortal realm. This discovery shattered the last remnants of Dubois' rational hypothesis of a human-led revenge plot. No human conspiracy, no voodoo curse as he understood it, could account for such a bizarre physical residue. The strange dust and the scent of sulfur were evidence of an unnatural process, a form of destruction that did not operate according to the laws of nature. It suggested a power that did not just kill, but unmade its victims, leaving behind not a body, but a sterile, elemental trace of their annihilation. The impact of this revelation is starkly visible in the pages of his journal. The neat, analytical script of the previous entries gives way to a more frantic, desperate hand. His writing becomes less of an investigation and more of a theological treatise on the nature of evil. He fills pages with quotes from St. Augustine and Thomas Aquinas, wrestling with concepts of infernal pacts, demonic possession, and the thinness of the veil that separates the physical world from the spiritual. He was no longer a detective. He was an exorcist preparing for a spiritual war. The irrefutable evidence did not bring him clarity, but a more profound and terrifying form of certainty. He was certain now that he was not dealing with human agents, but with a singular, ancient entity that had been unleashed. Amara, he now believed, was not merely a vessel, she was a gateway. The market had not just sold a woman, it had opened a door, and something had walked through it into the heart of his city. His mission was no longer to find a person, but to confront a presence. This shift in his understanding is a critical turning point in the narrative. The horror is no longer rooted in human cruelty, which is at least comprehensible, but in a cosmic evil that defies human logic. The mystery has transcended the social and moral realm and has become deeply, terrifyingly spiritual. The stakes are no longer about justice for the dead, but about the salvation of the living and the sanctity of the world itself. The documented impact on Dubois was one of complete psychological and spiritual realignment. He ceased his attempts to engage with the city's human institutions. He understood now that they were irrelevant, powerless against the force he had identified. His focus turned inward toward prayer, fasting, and the study of ancient rites of protection and exorcism. He was preparing himself for a confrontation that he knew would be fought not with evidence and reason, but with faith and will. The section concludes with Dubois writing a single, chilling sentence that summarizes his new reality. After pages of theological debate, he writes, "I mistook this for an earthly matter of sin and retribution, a crime to be solved. I see now it is a spiritual war, a battle for the soul of this place, and I am the only soldier left on the field." Ooh, this declaration of purpose sets the stage for the final desperate acts of his investigation and for the terrifying climax that he now sees as inevitable. Driven by his new, terrifying certainty, Father Dubois' journal records his decision to undertake one final act of human investigation before committing to a spiritual battle. He resolved to find and confront the one man who stood at the nexus of the profane and the sacred, the disgraced priest, Father Jean-Pierre Moreau. Dubois believed that Moreau, as the master of ceremonies for the market's blasphemous rituals, must have sensed the true nature of the power he was serving. The priest's journey to find him is described as a descent into a physical and moral swampland that mirrored the corruption of the city. He found Moreau not in a church, but in a squalid shack built on stilts in the cypress swamps west of New Orleans, a place of mud, decay, and oppressive silence. The man who greeted him was no longer the confident theatrical performer from the theater stage. Moreau was a wreck. His body thin, his hands trembling, his eyes wide with a terror that Dubois recognized as soul-deep. The authority Moreau had once projected, even in his disgrace, had completely collapsed, leaving behind only a shell of a man haunted by what he had helped to unleash. The confrontation, as documented by Dubois, was not an interrogation, but a desperate babbling confession. Moreau admitted that he had felt something wrong on the night Amara was sold, a coldness on the stage that was not of the natural world. He confessed that when the buyers had approached her, he had seen a flicker in the air around her, a shadow that moved behind her eyes, a presence that was ancient, intelligent, and utterly without mercy. He had been so terrified that he had fled the city the very next day, hiding in the swamp like a hunted animal. Moreau's confession provided the final crucial piece of the puzzle regarding the market's rituals. He admitted that his blessings were not just a cynical performance to soothe the buyers' consciences. He had been using fragments of older, pre-Christian rites he had discovered in forbidden texts, rituals he believed would bind the slaves' spirits to their new masters, ensuring their absolute compliance. He had thought it was a game, a way to exert power and earn the money he needed to survive. He now understood he had been playing with forces far beyond his comprehension. The most damning part of his confession was his final admission about the transaction involving Amara. With tears streaming down his face, Moreau told Dubois that when he had placed his hands on her to perform his ritual, he had felt a voice in his mind, a voice that was not hers, that had told him what to say. He had recited the words it gave him, words in a language he did not know. The collapse of his authority was complete with his final whispered words. "I did not bless the sale, Father. I consecrated their damnation." This meeting represents the total moral and functional collapse of the story's corrupt human authority. Moreau, the figure who had given the market its blasphemous legitimacy, was now revealed to be its first victim, a man driven mad by the very power he had sought to control. His terror was proof of the entity's existence, a testament from a fallen priest who had looked directly into the abyss and had been broken by what he saw. He was no longer a villain, but a pitiable, terrified fool who had made a catastrophic mistake. For Dubois, Moreau's confession was both a vindication and a terrifying confirmation of his fears. It erased any lingering doubt about the nature of the threat. The entity was real, it was intelligent, and it had used the market's own profane rituals to select and mark its victims. The entire affair had been a trap, and Moreau had been the unwitting baiter. The horror of this realization solidified Dubois' resolve to act, to try to undo the spiritual damage that Moreau had wrought. As Dubois prepared to leave the shack, a final, desperate gesture from Moreau changed the course of the investigation once more. The disgraced priest, sobbing, pressed a small, scorched book into Dubois' hand, a leather-bound ledger. He told Dubois it was the market's secret account book, a record of every transaction, every name. He begged Dubois to take it, to use it to understand, and then to destroy it. This act, the surrendering of the market's hidden heart, symbolized the complete abdication of his role. The scene ends with Dubois leaving Moreau to his fate in the swamp, the ledger heavy in his hands. The human authority of the market had crumbled into a terrified, incoherent mess. All that remained was the spiritual authority of the entity that now haunted the city, and the lone, determined authority of Father Dubois, who now held the key to its origins. The time for investigation was over. The time for confrontation was about to begin. The ledger that Father Moreau had pressed into Father Dubois' hands became the story's new hidden source, a document that would fundamentally alter his understanding of the mystery. Back in the seclusion of his cathedral quarters, Dubois' journal describes his examination of the scorched book. It was a meticulous record of human misery, its pages filled with names, ages, origins, and prices, a cold financial accounting of the market's profane commerce. The names of the disappeared buyers were all there, listed alongside the human beings they had purchased. As he turned the pages, he found the entry for Amara. It was here that he discovered the book's greatest secret. Next to her name, in the space where a price should have been written, there was only a single hand-drawn symbol. Dubois describes it as a complex sigil, an interlocking pattern of lines and curves, unlike anything he had ever seen in Christian or even pagan iconography. It was drawn with a stark, deliberate precision that set it apart from the hurried script on the rest of the page. It was not a price. It was a warning. Tucked within the folded crease of that same page was a small, brittle piece of paper, a note written in Moreau's trembling hand. The note provided the final piece of Amara's history, the key to the entire mystery. It read, "From the Ashanti region. The traders said she was a priestess, that her people were defeated in a tribal war. They said she did not speak, but listened. I thought it was superstition. They warned me not to remove the amulet from her neck, but the buyer insisted. It was part of the price." This hidden text transformed Dubois' understanding of the events. Amara was not a random victim who had become a vessel for a vengeful spirit. She was a spiritual authority in her own right, a priestess from a powerful tradition. The market had not simply sold a slave, it had captured and desecrated a holy person. The madness she was accused of was likely a deep, meditative silence, a sign of her spiritual power that her captors had misinterpreted as insanity. The entire affair had been an act of profound sacrilege. The mention of the amulet was the most critical revelation. Dubois now understood that the sigil in the ledger was likely a representation of the ward on that amulet. It was not a mark of ownership, but a symbol of protection. He realized, with a wave of cold dread, that the amulet was not meant to protect Amara. It was meant to protect everyone else from what she contained or what she could channel. It was a seal designed to hold a powerful and perhaps dangerous entity in check. The buyer's insistence on removing it, an act of ultimate dominance, had been a catastrophic error. In their arrogance, they had not just claimed a human body, they had broken a seal, releasing a power that had been carefully contained. The justice that followed was not a random curse, but a direct consequence of this act of desecration. The entity, now unbound, was simply reclaiming what belonged to it, starting with the men who had violated its sanctuary. This new understanding reshaped Dubois' entire perception of the conflict. The entity was not necessarily demonic in the Christian sense. It may have been a guardian spirit, a deity from Amara's homeland, now acting as a righteous avenger for its captured priestess. The events were not an invasion of hell, but a response from a different, older spiritual tradition to a profound insult. The horror was not that a demon was loose in New Orleans, but that the city's elite had, through their ignorance and cruelty, provoked the wrath of a god they did not know existed. The ledger, with its hidden sigil and note, became the Rosetta Stone for the entire mystery. It provided the origin, the motive, and the mechanism of the supernatural events. It also sealed Dubois' conviction that human authorities were useless. This was a matter that could only be addressed on a spiritual plane. He could not fight the entity, but he might be able to find a way to restore the balance that had been broken, to close the gateway that had been opened. The section concludes with Dubois carefully copying the sigil from the ledger into his own journal. He writes that he does not know its meaning, but he feels its power. It is a key, and he now understands that his final, decisive action must take place at the source of the desecration, the abandoned theater. The hidden source had given him not just answers, but a terrifying new purpose. He now knew what he had to do. The discovery of Amara's true identity and the breaking of the seal galvanized Father Dubois into planning his final, decisive action. His journal entries from this point forward cease to be investigative and become a detailed, methodical record of his preparations for a spiritual confrontation. He no longer saw any hope in appealing to human institutions. The city government, the police, and his own church had proven themselves to be morally bankrupt and willfully blind. The theater, he concluded, had become more than just a location. It was a wound in the spiritual fabric of the city, a consecrated ground for a foreign and vengeful power. His justification for the action he was about to take is laid out with the cold, clear logic of a military strategist. He writes that since the earthly authorities had failed to act, and since God himself had remained silent, it fell to him, as a sworn servant of the divine, to intervene. It was his duty to attempt to cleanse the site, not for the sake of the city that had forsaken its own soul, but for the sake of the cosmic order that had been violated. He was not acting as a priest of New Orleans, but as an agent of a broader, more universal law. The narrative of his journal then shifts to a stark and detailed account of his preparations. He describes gathering the materials needed for a rite of desecration, a little-known and dangerous ritual designed not to exorcise a person, but to permanently sever a place from a malevolent spiritual influence. He writes of spending days in prayer and fasting to purify himself, to make himself a worthy instrument for the task ahead. The process was as much about preparing his soul as it was about gathering the physical components of the rite. He details the items with meticulous precision, gallons of holy water, which he blessed himself in a private, intense ceremony, pounds of consecrated salt to create a barrier against the entity's influence, and flasks of sacred chrism oil, which he intended to use to anoint and seal the theater's doors and stage. These were the ancient weapons of his faith, and he was preparing to wield them against a power that his faith had never anticipated. The juxtaposition of these familiar Catholic elements with the alien Ashanti sigil he had copied into his journal highlights the strange, syncretic nature of the spiritual battle he was about to wage. The suspense in this section builds not through action, but through the cold, deliberate detailing of these preparations. Each blessed object, each recited prayer is imbued with a sense of finality. Dubois is a man preparing for a journey from which he does not expect to return. He writes of organizing his meager personal effects, of writing a final sealed letter to his sister in France, and of burning Moreau's ledger, destroying the last physical record of the market, save for his own journal. He was systematically erasing his own presence from the world, leaving only the testimony he was now compiling. His justification becomes increasingly fatalistic. He acknowledges that he does not know if the ritual will even work against a power that is not of demonic origin. He might be walking into a spiritual conflict for which his theological arsenal is completely unsuited, but he believes he has no other choice. To do nothing would be the ultimate sin of cowardice, a final surrender to the evil that had consumed his city. His action was a final, desperate act of faith, a leap into a spiritual darkness with only his belief to guide him. The plan itself was simple and direct. He would enter the theater at night, on the anniversary of Amara's sale. He would erect a circle of consecrated salt around the stage, the focal point of the desecration. Then he would perform the rite, calling on the authority of his own god to nullify the spiritual claim the entity had on the location. He would then seal the building's entrances with the holy oil, turning it from a profane temple into a permanent prison. The journal entry detailing this plan is a testament to his courage and his despair. He is fully aware that he is likely walking to his death, that the entity he is about to confront has already erased more powerful men than he. But his decision is framed as an inevitability, the only possible conclusion to the path he has been on since he first heard whispers of the market. He is driven by a profound sense of duty that transcends his fear. The entry concludes with a sentence that serves as his final, chilling self-assessment, a moment of introspection before the final battle. It captures the essence of his sacrifice and the depth of his resolve, a perfect hook for the climax to come. He writes, "I do not know if I go to close the gates of hell or merely to lock myself inside with the damned. It no longer matters. A shepherd must be willing to enter the wolf's den, even if he knows he will not walk out." Dessous, the last entry in the journal of Father Antoine Dubois, is the final primary source of the case, a document that stands as one of the most terrifying and enigmatic accounts in the hidden archives of American history. The entry is dated the night of his planned ritual, the anniversary of Amara's sale. The writing itself is a stark departure from the elegant, controlled script of the preceding pages. The lines are jagged, the words broken and fragmented, the ink smudged as if written by a trembling hand in profound haste and terror. It is not a narrative. It is a desperate transmission from the heart of a supernatural event. The entry begins as he enters the theater. "The doors were not locked," he writes. "They were waiting." He describes the interior as unnaturally cold, the air thick with a silence that is not empty but full, a heavy, listening presence. The velvet seats are coated in a fine layer of what he at first thinks is dust, but then realizes is a grey, uniform ash. He writes, "It falls like black snow, a remnant of something that has been unmade here." The image is one of sterile, absolute desolation, a place where life has not just ended, but has been erased. His fragmented notes describe his attempt to begin the ritual. He reaches the stage, the consecrated salt heavy in his satchel, but he cannot bring himself to open it. "The presence on the stage," he writes, "is overwhelming. She is here without being here," he scrawls, a paradoxical phrase that captures the nature of the entity. He does not see Amara, but he feels her, or the power that uses her as its anchor. It is a consciousness that permeates every corner of the theater, and it is aware of his intrusion. The climax of the entry and of the entire story comes not from an action, but from a sound. Dubois describes hearing a voice, a woman's voice, that is not coming from the stage, but from the very walls of the theater. The voice is not speaking to him. It is calmly, methodically, shouting the names of the men who had bid on Amara that night. Devereux, Richard. Each name echoes in the vast, empty space, and with each name, Dubois describes a flicker of orange light, a brief, intense heat that seems to come from nowhere. It is then that he understands the true nature of the event taking place. He writes in a script that is barely legible, "This is not a fire of wood and cloth. It is a fire of judgment, a fire of souls." He realizes that the theatre is not simply going to burn. It is being systematically purged by a supernatural flame. The disappearances were not separate events. They were the kindling. This was the final conflagration, the moment when the entity would reclaim the site entirely, burning away not just the physical structure, but the spiritual stain of every person who had profaned it. The emotional impact of this final entry comes from its immediacy and its rawness. The audience is placed directly inside the event, experiencing the terror through Dubois' fractured perceptions. The horror is not in seeing a monster, but in comprehending a form of justice that is so absolute and so alien that it defies all human moral categories. It is a force of nature, a spiritual cleansing that is as impersonal and as unstoppable as a tsunami. The interpretation of this final source has haunted researchers for decades. Is it the literal account of a supernatural event, or the final, terrified ramblings of a man suffering a psychotic break in a burning building? The text itself provides no easy answers. It is a purely subjective account of an impossible event, a perfect example of supernatural realism, where the line between the physical and the metaphysical is completely dissolved. The journal's last words are the most chilling. After describing the fire of souls, the entry breaks off into a series of disconnected phrases. The names, all the names, the building groans, it knows. And then, a final, spidery scrawl that trails off the page. A sentence that seems directed at the very act of his writing, at the journal itself. The final words are, "It sees me." This last phrase suggests the entity was aware not only of his presence, but of his attempt to document its existence, turning his act of witnessing into a fatal transgression. The entry ends there. The rest of the page is blank. The silence that follows is absolute. The final primary source does not resolve the mystery, it eternalizes it. It provides a direct, terrifying glimpse into the climax of the story, but leaves the ultimate fate of its narrator and the true nature of the entity to the imagination. The interpretation is left to the audience, who must decide for themselves what they believe happened in that theater on that final terrible night. In the aftermath of the night described in Father Dubois' final journal entry, the official historical record moves swiftly to erase the event, replacing the terrifying, supernatural truth with a mundane, plausible fiction. The first of these secondary sources is a report from the New Orleans Fire Department, dated the morning after the incident in 1852. The document, brief and dismissive, attributes the cause of the theater fire to a severe electrical storm that passed over the city, causing a lightning strike that ignited the aging dry structure. It is a simple, scientific explanation for an event that, according to Dubois' journal, was anything but. This official report, however, contains two details that, when viewed through the lens of Dubois' account, become deeply unsettling. First, meteorological archives from that period show no record of a significant electrical storm over New Orleans on that specific night. It was a calm, humid evening. Second, the fire chief's report notes with some confusion that the theater's massive front gates were found to be bolted and chained from the inside, a physical impossibility in a building that was supposed to be empty. This detail is mentioned as a curiosity and is never investigated further. The disappearances of the city's prominent businessmen were handled with similar discretion. A series of short articles published in the city's newspapers over the following months allude to the unfortunate and mysterious circumstances under which these men had abandoned their posts. The narratives crafted were of financial ruin, secret debts, or domestic disputes, plausible fictions that allowed society to absorb the losses without having to confront the terrifying pattern that connected them. The market and the woman named Amara are never mentioned in any official capacity. She vanishes from the historical record as completely as the men who tried to buy her. The legacy of Father Antoine Dubois was treated with equal care. Church records from the Archdiocese of New Orleans list him as having abandoned his post in late 1852. A private letter from the bishop to a colleague in Rome, discovered decades later, speaks of a troubled young priest who fell into a deep religious mania and wandered off into the swamps, a narrative designed to dismiss his actions as the product of a disturbed mind rather than a righteous crusade. He was not a martyr, he was an aberration, a problem that had conveniently solved itself. The true legacy of the events, however, survived not in the official archives, but in the city's folklore. The narrative voice presents evidence from the Federal Writers' Project of the 1930s, which collected oral histories from the descendants of the city's enslaved population. In these stories, the abandoned theatre was never forgotten. It was referred to as the Ash-Covered Theatre, or the House of Voices, a cursed place that the community knew to avoid. The legend, passed down through generations, was remarkably consistent with Dubois' account. These oral histories speak of a powerful African priestess who was wronged and who called down a fire that did not burn but ate the souls of the wicked. They speak of a lone white priest who tried to intervene and was consumed by the same fire. And most disturbingly, they contain the enduring local legend of a woman's voice that can still be heard on hot, still summer nights near the site where the theatre once stood. A voice that is said to be calling out the names of the dead, a warning that the debt has been paid, but the account is not yet closed. This transformation of the historical event into folklore is the ultimate consequence. While the official records provide a narrative of denial and erasure, the collective memory of the community preserved a version of the truth that was, in its essence, more accurate. The story of the Market of the Lost did not disappear. It simply went underground, becoming a ghost story, a cautionary tale, a permanent part of the city's spiritual landscape. The physical site of the theatre itself became a testament to this legacy. After the fire, the land remained empty for decades, a blackened, barren lot that no one would buy. Local superstition held that the ground was cursed, that nothing would ever grow there again. The land became a scar on the city's map, a physical reminder of a wound that had never properly healed. The consequences were not just social and historical, but geographical. The final piece of the legacy is the journal itself. Its survival is the ultimate defiance of the erasure. It is a voice from the heart of the fire, a testament that bridges the gap between the official fiction and the folkloric truth. It confirms that the legends were not just stories, they were history, a history that was too terrible to be recorded, but too powerful to be forgotten. The journal ensures that what happened at the Market of the Lost remains a part of the documented, if hidden, historical record. The Journal of Father Antoine Dubois, read in its entirety, presents more than just a historical curiosity. It is a profound and disturbing counter-narrative to the sanitized history of antebellum New Orleans. It suggests that beneath the city's celebrated commerce and culture lay a hidden geography of sin, a place where the era's casual cruelties were concentrated into a singular, explosive act of sacrilege. The story of the Market of the Lost is a case study in how a society can choose to systematically forget an event that is too damning to its own self-image. The fire that consumed the theatre was not an ending, but a transformation, turning a site of hidden crime into a permanent open wound in the city's memory. The central question that has haunted the few historians who have studied the journal is the nature of the entity at the heart of the story. Was it, as Dubois began to suspect, a righteous guardian spirit from an Ashanti tradition, acting to avenge its priestess? Or was it a more chaotic, demonic force drawn to the profound evil of the market and using Amara as a convenient vessel? The text offers no definitive answer, leaving the power nameless and its ultimate motives inscrutable. This ambiguity is perhaps the story's most unsettling legacy, suggesting that there are forces in the universe that operate according to a moral calculus that is utterly alien to our own. The physical evidence of the case has been almost entirely erased. The theatre was never rebuilt. The land it occupied was eventually incorporated into the city's expanding downtown district. Today, a multi-story parking garage stands on the site, a monument of modern utility built directly on top of a place of profound spiritual violence. Thousands of people pass through this space daily, entirely unaware of the history that lies dormant beneath the concrete and steel, a perfect metaphor for how progress is often built upon a foundation of forgotten horrors. This act of building over the site, however, has not entirely silenced its legacy. A final piece of evidence brings the story into the modern day, suggesting that the events of 1852 are not entirely over. A 2018 geological survey, commissioned before a planned renovation of the parking garage, was abruptly halted. The report, obtained through a Freedom of Information request, notes a series of unexplained anomalies at the site. It details persistent and severe electromagnetic interference that disrupted their equipment and a statistically improbable incidence of deep foundation cracks, as if the ground itself were unstable and resisting the weight of the structure above it. The report concludes with a recommendation against any further deep core drilling, citing unpredictable substrate volatility. This modern scientific language describes a phenomenon that Father Dubois would have instantly recognized. The ground is unquiet. The place where the theatre stood remains a weak spot, a point of spiritual disturbance that continues to manifest itself, even a century and a half later. The seal that Dubois may have inadvertently helped to create is perhaps not as permanent as he had hoped. This leaves us with the final open question of the narrative. What power did Amara truly unleash upon the city of New Orleans? Was the fire a final act of retribution, or was it merely the closing of a door that could one day be reopened? The story of the Market of the Lost serves as a chilling reminder that history is not just a record of what happened, but also a record of what has been buried. It suggests that some secrets do not stay buried forever. The case remains unresolved, a dark footnote in the city's past. It is a story about the profound evil of slavery, but also about the terrifying consequences that can occur when one culture, in its arrogance, desecrates the sacred traditions of another. It speaks to the power of belief, the courage of a lone dissenter, and the terrifying capacity of an entire society to look away from a truth it cannot bear to face. The journal of Father Antoine Dubois remains in the archives, a silent testament to his sacrifice. His body was never found. He exists now only as a voice on the page, a witness to a horror that the world chose to forget. And perhaps the most disturbing thought of all is that the entity he faced, the power that was sealed away beneath the streets of the city, is not gone. It is merely silent, it is merely listening, and it is waiting. History is not a collection of settled facts. It is a landscape of buried truths, and every so often, one of them finds its way back to the surface. The stories we tell here on Before the Story are not meant to give you easy answers. They are designed to make you question the official record, to make you feel the weight of what has been forgotten. If you believe that understanding the present requires us to bravely confront the darkest corners of the past, then join this community of historical investigators. Subscribe to Before the Story, because the most important part of any story is the truth that came before.